Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 5 of the iProgress podcast. I'm Dean and I'm joined as always by Craig. So the topic of today's podcast is looking at that peer review process. Now, any academic will tell you that the peer review process is something that we both love and hate. We love the fact that we're able to get all of our research out there and get new eyes looking at our research, but we hate the fact that the process can take so long. It can undergo several revisions. It doesn't always go as smoothly as we want it to, and this is something that we're going to be talking about in our second topic, looking at some of those gripes of the peer review process. So before we go into kind of introducing peer review and talking about the general importance of it, Craig, you're somewhere different today. Where are you?
I am currently in an unnamed budget hotel in the west of London. If anyone is in the UK and is watching on YouTube, you probably will know which chain I'm in just by looking at the colour of the headboard. I haven't seen our beloved comedian friend yet, but I'm sure he's digging around somewhere.
Fantastic. So, I mean, obviously, our kind of regular listeners and viewers will know the high quality of this podcast. So hopefully, you know, just bringing it a little bit further down in terms of the wireless internet, and you know, nothing can possibly go wrong within the next 40 minutes. So
hopefully not.
Hopefully not indeed. So in terms of kind of the first topic of today, we really want to frame a good introduction to the peer review process. So for non-academics out there, or academics who have maybe just finished their masters, they're just starting their PhDs, and they don't actually know about how to get a paper published, the process goes along the lines of such. You finish off your manuscript, you decide with your collaborators that you're happy to submit it. You then go to whichever specified journal of your choice. Now, we always try to go for those higher impact journals first, get rejections, and then work our way down, you know, unless we get lucky and we get those high-end acceptance, which many of us are still waiting for. And we submit our work typically to a portal. We have to change the formatting of our documents. We have to maybe put tables in different places. We need to insert our abstracts. We need to assign some keywords. And then all after this has been completed, we then press that submit button and it goes to an editor somewhere in digital space or an academic. It falls into their inbox. And then their job is to allocate your work to a reviewer. Now, this reviewer hopefully is somebody who's going to be an expert in the field, someone who's got very high knowledge about your particular research field. But as we've spoken about in previous weeks and iterations of this podcast, oftentimes that might not be possible. There might be PhD students out there who have done a great PhD project and they're the core expert in that very niche element of their field, and as such it might go to a reviewer who has some knowledge of a particular area, but they might not know specifically about this very niche topic. They might not know everything about this particular method that you have used. And as such, when we do any sort of work preparing our undergraduate students, our masters, PhD students, or even early career academics who we are supporting their development, that's why we hammer home the fact that you need to make sure that your writing is crystal clear. You need to make sure that any layperson, even an academic with years of experience, but they perhaps don't know too much about this particular topic, that they can pick it up and it be as accessible as possible so they can understand exactly what you're talking about. It then sits with the reviewer for hopefully around the month, but as we're going to be talking about in topic 2, that can be quite a while sometimes. And then it comes back either with a favorable or in some cases not so favorable opinion. So Craig, what's your kind of overall experiences in terms of peer review? Now, we've obviously got a paper that we're going to be talking about in our third topic later on, but just in general, what are your thoughts of the peer review process?
Like many academics, I think very mixed feelings of the peer review process, particularly at the moment as I'm sitting today, coming off last week, the back of 2 difficult decisions. So one that was a rejection, another one that was a considerable revise and resubmit. And one thing I don't think you maybe touched on in that introduction was what the possible outcomes might be in relation to some of those. So it might be that you get a straight accept, which is great. If it's your first submission of that particular paper, it's probably unlikely that you're going to get an acceptance straight away. What is more likely is that you'll get a revise and resubmit decision, which basically means that the editor and the reviewers see some value in your paper, and then they're asking you to revise it in a particular way, so to submit it again for reconsideration. And then hopefully after that, or maybe after another iteration of that, you'll then get an acceptance for, after that process, or you can get a rejection. They seem to be the three kind of key outcomes or potential outcomes: acceptance, or publish as is, revise and resubmit, or publish with minor amendments, or rejection. I've had mixed experiences with peer reviews. I've been fairly fortunate, I think, in terms of a lot of the work that I've done has managed to get in the journals that I've wanted them to go into. But it's been a struggle, to be honest, to get them into these journals, because, like you said, we all want to go for the highest possible impact journals. And I know that we might touch on what impact factors are in a few minutes' time, in terms of how journals are maybe ranked or how you choose a journal. But I think ultimately, even though we know that these numbers are artificial, we know that they are arbitrary kind of indices of quality, or maybe not quality even, but prestige. We still play the game. We still go along with those numbers, and we still submit to those highest impact factor journals. But ultimately, what that means is that it goes through multiple iterations, multiple rounds of review. I think the most reviews I've done, or revisions that I've done for one particular paper before it was published, is about 6, which is frankly farcical, to be honest. I think was
that a paper that we was on together?
It might have been, actually.
Yeah, I
don't remember which paper it was.
I've definitely had 6 rounds of revisions, and each I think if it is the one I'm thinking of, overall I think we topped about 450 comments that the editors wanted. It almost felt the reviewers and editors wanted, and it almost felt that it wasn't our paper at the end of it. It just felt like it was an entirely new paper that perhaps veered away from the points that we was trying to discuss from the off.
I think they let us keep the title. I think that was an important part, that we were adamant that we wanted to keep the title. But I think we both know one particular person who will like that, in terms of sticking to their guns on a title.
Yeah, it's always the most important part to put your foot down on, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, I think that particular paper, the reviewer comments for the first iteration of that, I think we sent a document back that was about 25 pages, something like that, of responses, point by point. What do they want? What have we done? What are we maybe pushing back on? But I've had some, and again, one actually that you were on with me with another person, where we basically got an email back saying, yes, this is fine, with no reviewer feedback. So it just goes to show kind of the disparity, I guess. And to be honest, that I didn't like that as much as I didn't like the lots of feedback, because ultimately I want to know firstly that someone's actually read the paper before it's published. And with that particular submission, we submitted the paper, and it basically, so I didn't even get an email, actually. It was a direct message on Twitter from the editor of the journal saying, thanks for your submission, we've accepted it. Fantastic. And that was it. That was the only feedback I got. Which again, who's read this? What were the reviewer comments? There's no paper that's perfect, and I think that's something to acknowledge. Even when you go after 4, 5, 6 rounds of reviews, that paper is still not perfect. It's good enough to get in the journal at that point. So to get no feedback whatsoever, for me, highlights potentially an even bigger issue with peer review, in that I wasn't convinced that anyone actually read that paper. And that's gone on to be a massively cited paper as well. So it's kind of a bittersweet, I think, in terms of the impact that that's had on our CVs, but also in terms of our thoughts about the peer review process. So yeah, very mixed experiences, mixed feelings about peer review.
Yeah, and I think I would very much echo that. It's a little bit torn, isn't it? Because we do want timely feedback and comments, just as anyone would if they send their work to a supervisor or a mentor. You know, you want that feedback more or less straight away. You want to be able to action it and ultimately as fast as possible, you know, whilst people are reading and engaging your work, get a paper out there that the majority of the people are happy with, and there's very few minor comments, if that, you know, which can be addressed. Alternatively, you know, I think we've had some really negative experiences between us and also together in terms of having to wait so long. And we're going to be talking about in kind of topic 2 about why that might be, you know, and some of our gripes are around that. But just to kind of, I guess, round off, talking about the importance of peer review. It is a vital process because we want to make sure that the work we're putting out there isn't just our opinion, which sometimes, you know, might be biased. This is one of the actions of keeping us honest and keeping us on the straight and narrow. We also want to make sure that we haven't made mistakes, you know, because there is a problem with the replication crisis, especially in psychology, but I'm assuming more broadly in academia at the minute, where some of these older pieces of research can't be replicated. So actually, was everything picked up in the peer review process? Did we ask to see methods? Did we ask to see analyses? You know, did we have that data set that we can replicate as reviewers? Because that's obviously important. And then just to touch on something that we kind of left in the air was this impact factor. Now, what the impact factor is, it's a number which is reflective of, on average, this is how many citations your paper will get in a particular journal if it's accepted within a particular year or over a 5-year period. There's some kind of more broader impact factors. And obviously, from a prestige point of view, the higher the impact factor, the more citations your paper is going to get, the better, you know, one of your papers is. Now it's quite interesting because depending on the papers that are published in those particular journals, those impact factors could potentially vary greatly year upon year. And now I know that we've submitted to a journal in the past that had an impact factor of 1 point something. I'll let you Google in the background for us. I think now that journal is around, I want to say 8, but it might even be higher. And that's because it published quite a lot of COVID-related papers, mental health during COVID-related papers, which has obviously vastly amplified the potential impact of that journal. Now, that's obviously a very sort of potentially short-lived, but if you're looking at what journals you can apply for and submit your work to, that's going to be glaring that you want to apply for that. Have we got the number?
Yeah, 11.6.
11.6. So on average, if you submit a paper that is published, it's going to get 11.5 citations per year. Now that was 1.8 something when we first submitted to it, and that's just ridiculous over a 2-3 year period.
Yeah, exactly. That was 2 years ago that we submitted that paper, maybe 2.5 years. But yeah, so wow. For a journal impact factor to jump that much in such a short space of time suggests that there's something going on potentially at that journal, potentially in that field, that is artificially inflating that impact factor. Sure.
Which kind of just echoes onto the point which you very quickly, but I think elegantly made, where these numbers are quite arbitrary. You know, that they fluctuate very quickly. And we brought it up actually in last time's podcast, where we talked about we might submit a paper, it might get published, and a couple of people will read it and cite it within a year. However, we could get that same information, present it as a podcast, put it out as a tweet, you know, make a YouTube video out of it, and actually hundreds of people will see it within a day. So when you're looking at impact, is actually publishing in a journal the true metric of the impact of your work, or should we be looking at these wider bibliometrics in terms of, okay, so actually how many people are retweeting this particular article, how many people are walking through a park and seeing one of our sculptures, if we're an art individual that we've made, you know, what's the foot traffic on that, how many people are stopping to look at this particular poster which we've generated, which has a detailed explanation of our research on it. So I think as academics looking forward, yes, the peer review process is vital, and the publication process is important to some degree, but we need to be having a much broader scope in terms of how we are creating impact. And I think that fit very well with the debate we was having about industry versus academia.
Yeah, just to jump in on that point around impact factors, there's something to be said about the fact that these things vary across different fields as well. So even within a single discipline, so we've said before how our background is in psychology. If you have a journal that is publishing purely cognitive psychology research,
sure,
that's going to have a much higher impact factor than something that is publishing mental health research, conceivably, except for the journal that we've just spoken about, or forensic psychology, for example. So I've done a lot of work, you've done a lot of work in the forensic psychology kind of field in terms of crime prevention. And those studies are much slower to get off the ground, to recruit for. And ultimately what that does is it slows down that research process. So ultimately what that does is it means that you maybe don't get the citations that you might get in the first year in cognitive psychology until the second or third year, which artificially, again, pushes down the impact factor in those forensic or mental health fields. So in cognitive psychology, if all you have to do, and I don't want to make this sound like I'm disparaging cognitive psychology, because I quite like cognitive psychology, but if all you need to do is to get 3 lots of 60 students in a lab and get them to press buttons for 10, 15 minutes and see if there's an effect of various different stimuli, that's much easier to recruit for, conceivably, hypothetically, than it is to get 60 people in prison to fill out a questionnaire or to do the same kind of task. It's just logistically not as easy to do that as it is to get the undergraduates in a lab. And what that does is it speeds up for the cognitive psychologists that publication process and that cycle of getting more papers out. And what that does is it pushes through more citations earlier in that paper's life cycle.
Sure. And I kind of guess if we're being really pedantic, that then back ends onto if individuals within a certain institution are both applying for promotion, without the context of all of this, then the individual who's getting those quick, I'm not going to say easier, but you know what I mean, kind of like logistically facilitated citations, publications, is probably going to be first on the ladder for that promotion, and that's quite actually saddening to hear. And obviously we're not backing that up with any data, but that's just, I kind of guess, from our experiences of working at various institutions.
Yeah, potentially, but I think the thing is that a lot of universities now are acknowledging these issues. So I know, so we both know that I've recently gone through this promotion process, and when I was applying, I did have to put impact factors on my application in terms of what the impact factors of the journals that I was publishing in. But I also had to list something called the SNP factor, which is a source normalized impact something, which basically tries to flatten out that curve. It tries to make everything equal. So it's what's the impact factor basically within that particular area. So instead of saying this person's publishing in impact factor journals of 1.5, this one's doing it in impact factors of 6, but they're working in different fields, they will try to normalize those impact factor indices, I guess. And it makes it a little bit fairer in terms. So you're looking at then within your subfield, what is the impact factor journal that you're publishing in? But again, it's still looking at citation rates. It's still looking at prestige of a journal rather than the quality of the research.
Yeah, and I kind of guess it goes back to that garbage in, garbage out. We can do as many metrics on the data as we want to. We can shape it in different ways. We can normalize it. We can flatten the curve. But if the initial data that we're using to make those post-hoc analyses isn't actually that relevant, then it almost doesn't matter what secondary analyses we do. So with that under our belt, and that felt like a little bit of a moan, which kind of, I guess, doesn't shape us up too well for topic 2, which is looking at some of the common gripes that we have with the peer review process. I'm going to start us off, and then I guess we can take it in turns and probably add to the crib notes that we've got and make this our longest podcast ever. But the first one I'm going to start us off is waiting times. Now, we alluded to this in topic 1. Not only waiting times in terms of getting that initial feedback back, but also waiting times in terms of, okay, so I've got that feedback. Now you're giving me 2 days, 5 days to make the changes, to which I then resubmit, and then I have to wait again. I have to wait for these reviewers to take a second look at it, which might take a month, 2 months, 3 months. And then I get potentially some feedback back and ask for more amendments. And suddenly this really timely piece of research, which we developed, we spent a lot of time writing and neatening up, suddenly it's not coming out until a year and a half later. Okay, and that's just the acceptance. So when we look back at our podcast on industry versus academia, the real impact that we're having as academics is almost being attenuated by these waiting times. Now, when we do look at kind of potential reasons for these waiting times, as academics, I get a lot, and I'm sure that Craig gets a lot as well. We get a lot of requests, and obviously we can't attend to all requests, and so because of that might sit with us for a couple of days. Then we reject it. It goes back to the editor, who then has to search for more reviewers. And so before it's actually even landed with somebody who agrees to review that paper, there might be 2-3 weeks. It might be being ping-ponged back and forth. Some people might be kind enough to say, okay, so actually, may I recommend these people? But that's very kind of rare and fewer part. Also, we might be thinking as academics, well, this actually, it's kind of in my workload, but it's not really planned. Like, I never get told at the start of the semester, oh, Dean, you've got time allocated for you to review 3 or 4 papers this semester. It's kind of, it goes back to what we were saying in previous podcasts about it almost feels like additional work. And because it feels like additional work, lots of people, or nobody really, gets paid for this. Okay, it's supposed to be mapping onto that academic community. We're being very collegial with each other. I'm going to review some papers in the hope that other people review papers, and we're probably going to have that as a mini conversation a little bit later in terms of, is this a good publication model? I personally disagree. Okay, doing any sort of work on top for free, especially when publishers are making lots of money off it, I vehemently disagree with it. But all of these additional points mean that individuals can be waiting a long time, and as time progresses, the impact that we're having on our work vastly decreases.
I mean, yeah, I totally agree. The point around workload is really important, I think. So I don't have any hours in my professional workload to do peer reviewing. It's just an expectation that you do it as a good scholar in whatever area you're in. You should be reviewing X number of papers for each paper that you submit. Because that's just what you do. So yeah, I think on average over the past kind of few years, I've been submitting anywhere between 4 and 6 papers a year. So what that means is that I should be reviewing anywhere between 12 and 18 papers per year. And if you think about the fact that each paper that you review, if you really want to give in-depth feedback, probably is going to take you couple of hours maybe to go through. That's an additional 30 hours ish over the course of a year. It's a full work week.
Yep.
So 30 hours on its face might not sound like a lot, but when you think about the fact that is a full work week of doing work that you're not paid to do, that you don't have any hours allocated to, that you're just being expected to do on top of everything else that you are doing. Yeah, I completely agree. It adds to that workload. It adds to that stress. It adds to that anxiety that people have. I've done reviews on the weekends and evenings just to get it done because I feel like that's what I should do. And you kind of alluded to the fact that we get so many requests for reviews. And I think this goes back to another gripe that people have with the peer review process. And this is not a kind of a having a go at journal editors, but the number of review invitations that you get that are just so far outside your area of expertise. And then you have to spend time going into their submission system to reject it. I kind of have a policy now. And I used to be really quite diligent about it. And try and give suggestions for reviewers and try to give reasons as to why I can't review a particular submission if it's been allocated to me. But now I think if someone is sending me a paper that is on, what was the one I had recently? It was something about messaging for health promotion. It's nothing to do with what I've done at any point in my career. We had that one paper that we published with one of our collaborators that was about fear of COVID-19. And I think because you've got that one paper that you might have the word health somewhere in the abstract, you then become seen as being someone who publishes on health. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, but it's people just not doing a thorough job identifying potential reviewers, and I don't think that's anything negative against the editors, because ultimately it's an additional workload job for them as well. But what it does is it means that I then have to look at the abstract that's been sent to me, realize that it's not anything that I can comment on, and then I have to click on the link to say I'm not going to do this. And then sometimes it will say, okay, you need to now create an account so you can log in to reject it. I've got a policy now. If they're asking me to create an account to reject something, I'm just not going to respond, because it's additional work for me to do that.
And I know we might get a little bit of grief from some of the listeners, but I'm exactly the same. And you can guarantee as well that when you come to log into the account, it doesn't work straight away. And so that's for like additional information, like your ORCID ID. It literally asks you to create an account with that journal so that you can click a button that says no. And again, I really don't want this to be a podcast where we just say, we said the same thing last week or we said the same thing before. When you look back at our podcast on industry versus academia, this is just an added complication that doesn't need to be there. It's a yes or no button that should just work. And I think that's going to be a common theme within these podcasts about academia. Why doesn't this just work? Why can't this just happen? It's really, really frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a full podcast on bureaucracy in academia, but I don't think either of our computers has got the bandwidth to handle that kind of length of episode. But yeah, I think going back to the idea of this is additional work, this not workloaded, it's not paid. I know there was a movement a couple of years ago about kind of, was it the 450 movement? Was it James Heathers?
Yes.
Put that forward. I know you kind of got a little bit of heat on Twitter for was it maybe supporting that? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no. So the 450 movement is essentially saying, as an academic, I should be paid for my additional workload, and this should be treated as consultancy because somebody's coming to me for my expert opinion on a particular topic. Now, this 450 is just, my understanding is an arbitrary number. So it's based on the fact that to do a good peer review, it should take about 5 hours. And this academic suggested that their hourly pay should be about $90, and so $90 over a minimum of 5 hours is $450. And as such, any big publisher, so we're talking about really big publishers that are actually charging thousands for these articles, and as academics, we're not seeing any of that money. So I think that should be stated there, and I think that's one of the reasons why this became so big. And so to kind of mediate against that, if someone's asking you to do work so they can earn money from your efforts, we should be charging. And this is where this 450 movement came from. And the gentleman who's set it up on Twitter, he gave templates in terms of emails. I must admit, I've sent a couple of these emails, and the responses that you get from editors just completely confused about why you're asking for money for your time and your effort. It's just really baffling for them. And as Craig said, like he's kindly offered to do reviews on the weekend before, because it's seen as an additional duty. And so you wouldn't go into a bar in a weekend and start tidying up the tables, because it's not your job. It's completely outside of that scope. Obviously you've got to sit there and eat and drink, so it's you can see that collegiality there. But you don't expect to do that and then not get paid for it, and I think that's where this kind of movement came from. And then you had lots of academics responding to that, saying, well, in that case, you shouldn't be submitting to journals, and you shouldn't be asking for your work to be peer reviewed. But I think the take-home message of that is, no, that's part of our job, to submit work. And so when we do that, journals who are reaping thousands and thousands and thousands a year off of our hard work should be allocating some of that funding back to the people who are facilitating that process, be it the people who are submitting articles to the journal, and also the people that are spending their time, evenings and weekends, reviewing it for the journal.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I'm sorry, I'm just looking up one of the major publishers, because I know you said there about reaping thousands and thousands.
I bet it's millions.
It's not thousands, it's not millions. It's so revenue for one of the biggest publishers. I won't say which one, but you can put a dollar sign in their name. Was 7.2 billion in 2021, with a profit of 2.21 billion.
That's ridiculous.
They're not short on money. They could potentially pay reviewers, they could pay authors, and that is a growth year on year of 15%. So they are growing over time as well.
Wow. So yeah, they're not short. They're not short of a few bob to distribute to the people who are helping them to grow to such a degree. But to be fair, if people are giving you products to sell, and if we look at this from a business model, if you sell calendars, you need to be buying or spending time manufacturing those calendars for you to sell for a profit. But if people just come to you and say, here are 1 million calendars for free, I don't want anything back from it, please sell them on my behalf so other people can look at my calendars, then you're not gonna turn it down, are you? You're not gonna turn it down. And it's just mind-boggling how we've allowed ourselves to get to this state of play whereby our jobs rely on us submitting to this process. But in addition to that, we've also got to help out at every single stage of this process, even when it comes to the proofs coming back from the journal. So after it's been accepted and we get the proofs back, we're then in charge of spell checking them and making amendments and making typos. We've had a group paper where I was like, no, let's not spend any time with this. We'll send it back to them and they'll do it. And I got a message back from someone in the group saying, no, it's not their job. It's part of our job. We need to make sure that the paper's as polished as possible. People get paid, and again, I'm going to use the word thousands, but it probably turns out to be millions or billions. People get paid thousands to copy edit. And it's just additional tasks, and I feel myself actually getting angry just by us talking about this. It's supposed to be a gripe, but maybe we should change the topic name to a frustration.
The thing is, it's even more perverse than that, isn't it? I think your calendar analogy is strange, but let's go with it anyway. So sure. It's almost put someone sending a big business their calendars, the business then saying, thanks, we maybe want to sell this, but we're not quite happy with it. Can you make some changes for nothing to your calendars? And then when we sell it, what we also want to do is for you to pay to have access to your own calendar. So that's the additional layer of nonsense, I guess, this whole process, in that we produce this for free, we review for free, and then our employers, our institutions, are then buying subscriptions for us to be able to access our own work. And there's been occasions where, not at the institution that I'm at the moment, but at a previous institution, where I've not had like a USB stick on me, I've not had access to my paper as a Word document. Someone sent me an email asking for a copy of the paper. I've gone onto the journal's website, tried to log in through my university credentials, and it said, you don't have access to this paper. It's like, but I wrote the paper. It's my paper. So yeah, there's lots of frustration in this. I think, like you said earlier about multiple rounds of feedback. We said at the beginning about how we've had papers going through 3, 4, 5, 6 rounds of review. adding new issues every time as well. There's one paper in particular that I had that it still makes me angry, so I'm not going to talk about it too much. But in fact, no, it wasn't that I had it. It was that we had. It was a joint paper again that we had. So we sent it to one journal. We got a revise and resubmit on that paper. We did every single point of feedback. We gave a really good response to each individual point. We sent it back, expecting it to just basically go through without it really being sent back, because we put so much detail in the reviewer response, so that an editor could just look at it and say, yeah, that's actually, there's no point in even wasting anyone else's time. What that editor then did was try to send it to the previous reviewers. They said no or didn't respond. So then what this reviewer did, or this editor did, was send it to somebody else who then found other issues with the paper that they didn't like. And then we ended up having that paper rejected. So for me, that should never happen. I think I'm not saying that a revise and resubmit should be automatically a guarantee to acceptance, because it shouldn't be. But if you've got relatively minor amendments to do, which was what that paper was, and you've addressed all of those things point by point, there shouldn't then be a new reviewer that comes on board and adds additional points. I think once you get a revise and resubmit, that is the journal telling you these are the things that you need to do to meet the eligibility criteria for acceptance in this journal. If you do those things, then that should be, for me, meeting the threshold for acceptance. If you try to do some of those things but do it in a suboptimal way or subpar way, then I think the journal's got a little bit of room to say, okay, you haven't met the criteria still. Here's another go. And maybe there should be a cap on how many times you can go through that process. But ultimately, you shouldn't be adding new reviewers. You shouldn't be reintroducing or introducing new points, for me anyway, after a round of review. It shouldn't be going to another reviewer. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I completely agree. And I think that was particularly frustrating, especially because we had gone through a lot of time and effort to address those points. And I think that some of the points the second reviewer made was essentially asking us to revert those changes back to what we had initially submitted, and that should never happen. And that's potentially on the shoulders of the editor. But again, we know that editors are doing this work for free, and actually it's easier for them to send it off to a reviewer than it is for them to sit down and look at that. So it's a huge cycle of people trying to shirk responsibility because they don't want to take on more tasks. And yeah, they're happy with those shorter tasks and signing things off. But I'm in the same position. I wouldn't want to, try and disentangle all of that. And then for the final kind of gripe that we have, we've got a huge list, but we're gonna curtail it. We're gonna keep the frustration down for the episode. Is when we are ultimately rejected from the highest impact factor journal that we submit to, we then go to submit straight away because we've made the additional comments and changes that we needed to. It's taken us a day and a half, a week maybe. We've made those changes. We go to resubmit the paper to a lesser prestigious journal, only to find out that we need to do our citations in a different way. We need to reformat our tables. We need to add an entirely new section that we didn't previously need to, because every single journal seems to be formatting differently. Some people want you to name the institution where the ethics was passed. Others don't. Some journals want a design section, other journals don't. And it's just, on top of that, different word limits as well. And so we find ourselves, maybe, I've done this before, I don't know if you have, Craig, but I've sometimes bypassed a particular journal because I didn't have the time or capacity to actually rewrite the paper for that journal's requirements. So I've sent it to a different journal. And again, why doesn't this just work? We could rename the podcast that. Why doesn't this just work? Why can't we just submit our papers to a centralized format or a free-flowing format, and then after it's accepted for the quality, then we spend the time formatting? So we only have to reformat once rather than 5, 6, 7 times.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. So let's start with the gripe. I guess start with the moan, because I'm going to kind of get on board with that a little bit in terms of word limits and page limits. Dean, when was the last time you read a paper journal?
A paper journal? Never. I cannot tell you. Probably during my undergraduate, which we established last podcast was over 10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, so in 2022, why do we have word limits and why do we have page limits when everyone, almost everyone, let's say, reads papers online as PDFs? I just don't understand it. I don't get it at all.
Never thought of
What
that.
this
I
leads
literally
to,
never thought of that.
what this leads to is, and I've been guilty of this myself, because journals, they force you into doing it. So basically, you have a big data set with multiple different questions that you're answering. And you know that you can't give any individual research question the time and attention that it needs within a page limit of, I don't know, 35 pages, including your references. You just can't do it. You can't put all of those research questions. So what you start to do is to think about, okay, well, there's this research question that's got studies 1 and 2. You've got this research question that's got studies 3 and 4. We'll split them into 2 papers. And then what you get is feedback from journals saying either there's not enough here or it's an incomplete answer, or you have good reviewers picking up on the fact that there's multiple papers being published using the same data set. And that's a problem. I think that really is a problem. And we all know people who are basically splitting data sets into as many different papers as possible. But I think if you're answering a completely different question, if you don't have a journal space that is allowing you to explore things in as much detail as you would like, for one thing, they force you into doing it. You have to do it in order to get that question answered in a comprehensive way. But what we're also doing is wasting resource in terms of peer review time. What could be one paper, one really good, strong paper with 3 or 4 different studies that is reviewed once by 3 reviewers, then becomes 2 slightly weaker papers that are reviewed by potentially 2 different sets of reviewers, and even worse, the same set of reviewers reading essentially the same paper twice. And it's a waste of people's time and effort. I've had papers in the past where it's been a fairly exploratory paper and there's been lots of analyses, and we've been basically trying to say, look, from this perspective, this is what we think. From this perspective, this is what the data is saying. And we've had people say, well, this paper's too long. Against what metric? There's no predefined thing, except for the fact that we don't like how many pages this is, that suggests that it's too long. So we've had to then take what I think is important analyses and just literally highlight things, copy and paste things into a supplement.
Yeah.
And every now and again in the paper say, well, okay, if you want information about this, see the supplement. It's still published. It's still just behind a paywall. It's just not with everything else. Like, if people want to go read it, they can still read it. It's the same information. So yeah, page limits for me are utterly farcical. I don't understand it at all, except in the small number of cases where people are still reading paper journals. And if people are doing that, it's 2022, guys. Let's move on a little bit. You don't need to do this.
Excellent.
The second point that you made was about an alternative way of doing peer review, and I really like that idea. I was reading a little while ago, actually, a book called Science Fictions by Stuart Ritchie. And in that book, what he said was that we should have what you described in terms of an open peer review process where you submit your papers to a particular repository, and then anyone can go on and review that paper.
Mm-hmm.
You're then properly crowdsourcing the reviews of your paper, and then over time your paper accrues a score, and then journals can almost bid for your papers.
Okay.
And if journals still want to maximize the number of citations that they're getting, then they'll be able to cream off the best papers of that repository, and they can pay for those papers if they want to. But what that means is that you don't have people being asked to review irrelevant papers. You can then, as an academic, if I'm wanting to do a literature review of the most recent research in my area, I can go onto that repository and I can see in the past week what's been written, what's been released. I can do a review of that. I can boost papers that I think are really good. I can give feedback on papers that I think could be improved. And then hopefully over time, the quality of scholarship goes up without that additional workload.
Sure.
And I think that's a really nice model. An alternative model is the registered reports process. And I think speaking about the issue of feedback that we get, having that registered reports model, and I must admit, I've not gone through it myself yet, and I'm really looking forward to doing it, is having, so just for people that aren't aware, a registered report is where you submit your study, your paper, up until the results section. So in psychology, for example, you'd have an introduction section where you're setting the scene, you'd have your statement of your research question or research problem, and then you'd have your proposed methods and analysis plan. And the reviewers then would be commenting on the quality of the science, the quality of the study, the quality of the design, so that it doesn't matter at that point what your data say in the end. Because what we see a lot of the time is that papers are published based on what the data say, rather than how good the science is or how good the study is in terms of its design.
Mm-hmm.
That stopped a lot of the comments that you might get in a peer review process that is like, well, okay, you're measuring impulsivity. Why did you measure that with the Barrett impulsivity scale rather than some other tasks that you could have measured impulsivity with? Why didn't you have this many people? Why didn't you have this sample? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? All of that's done in the planning. So you know that at that point, you've got a sound study that as long as you do what you've said you're going to do, it's going to be published whatever the data say. And I think those two approaches to peer review. So if you're going down the traditional route of formulating your plan, doing your study, and then submitting it, having that open peer review where journals can bid for the paper that's been reviewed openly and using those crowdsourcing methods is good. But ultimately, what I would like to see more of in the future is more use of these registered reports, because ultimately at that point, you know that what you're doing is good quality, and you can guarantee that irrespective of what you find, it's going to be published as long as you do what you said you're going to do. And I think that would solve a lot of problems that we have, not only with peer review, but with the quality of research that we see coming out of a lot of fields, particularly in the social sciences.
I very much agree on all those points. And I think that just going back to the kind of the model which I kind of proposed and you supported, we're in 2022, we can verify accounts. Okay, so actually we're not just having random people reviewing, you know. This is Dr. Craig Harper. He's got his little badge next to him to say he's a verified account, and you can even monetize that to some degree. You know, if you can be upvoted as a reviewer, and so the more reviews you do that are at a higher caliber, when that bidding process happens, that can then have almost like a Kickstarter program. You know, like if you have 10 people review this paper and you know they're all favorable or whatever the metrics are, then money generated can then trickle down to the reviewers, and everyone that will spur more people to take part in the review process. And it's a model that actually, when we're talking about billions that's available, it's a model that suddenly becomes extremely viable, and that actually academics will look forward to taking part in, rather than almost hiding away. So we've got around about 5 minutes left of the podcast. So Craig, I'm going to invite you to take a large sip of water and tell our kind of viewers and listeners about the best paper that we've ever written, which is currently sat in one of our inboxes somewhere. I've honestly, I'm losing the will with it now. But just tell everyone about it.
Right. So this is the infamous Brexit paper. So we started off back in 2017. So what are we now? 5 years ago, we started this project. We had an interest in, I had an interest in political psychology. Dean, you had an interest in personality and empathy, and we were reading some stuff, and it seemed that we could kind of bring those two areas together. So could it be that we could solve some of the issues around Brexit polarization by having people consider other people's perspectives? Fairly straightforward idea.
Extremely simple.
So what we thought we would do was to measure people's levels of empathy, whether that be affective empathy in terms of the emotional kind of response that people have, or cognitive empathy, which is about perspective taking. That was what we thought was potentially going to be important. And then look at their levels of polarization. Would they like to have someone who voted Brexit as a Remainer, for example? Would I like someone who voted Brexit to live next door to me, to be dating one of my children, to be a colleague? Really straightforward, self-report design, cross-sectional design. We got about 400-ish British members of the public, completely random community sample. We found the effect that we were expecting. Increased cognitive empathy leads to reduced or is associated with reduced polarization. We thought, great, it's timely, let's get that out there. We submitted that to a couple of journals. So we had one where they weren't sure necessarily that we were measuring polarization. We were sure that we were. So we clarified that with them.
The scale was actually called something about the polarization or something.
The
scale,
intergroup polarization scale. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, we amended that. We got the rejection for that first paper. We sent it to somewhere else. Had another rejection straight off the bat, and then we thought, okay, what can we do to beef this paper up a little bit? So at that point, we were midway through, I think, or it would have been just after Donald Trump's election.
It was just after Donald Trump's election, yeah.
Just after. So we thought, okay, most psychology journals now like Study 1, Study 2, sometimes Study 3. Let's run a complete replication of this, but just in the US context. Trump versus Clinton. Does increased polarization, is that associated with reduced levels of cognitive empathy? Alas, it was. So we've got Study 1 and Study 2 both saying exactly the same thing. Perspective taking is a potential route to reducing polarization in political contexts, in multiple contexts. So we're like, okay, great. Let's now send it to a different journal and get some feedback. So we sent it to one journal, and the feedback that we got was that the editor didn't understand the program not the analysis, but the program that we used for the analysis, and that was the reason for rejection.
We then saw. So I follow the editor on Twitter. 2 days later, I kid you not, I saw the editor tweeting, asking people whether they've heard of this program and what it does, and I was astounded. I was absolutely astounded that, first of all, they didn't Google it, but second of all, that was the reason for the rejection. No other comments about the methods, the rationale, the planning, the way we interpreted the results, because I genuinely don't think the editor got to that part. And the program we used, I'm not going to mention it because it might help to track the tweet I've just mentioned, but yes. It's a very well-known program, and it's taught at undergraduate and postgraduate. So I don't know.
Yeah. So we had that feedback, and then what happened after that was we were in talks actually with someone, again fairly well-known, who saw. So we posted this as a preprint, and got very good feedback from a couple of really huge names, high-profile, well-known people, and one of them actually offered us some money to do an intervention study, basically using this. So what we tried to do was to leverage that paper to get some funding to run an intervention study, just to get a Study 3. That fell through because of the time that it took. So by the time that person, by the time we got the second or third rejection, that person had moved on and had a different job.
Ironically, moved into industry.
So there was no longer any money available for that. We've since gone through another 3 iterations of this paper. We've been rejected on this paper at 6 different journals. And I know that people will be listening to this and watching this and thinking, well, clearly this is just a crap paper. If you've been rejected from 6 different journals, it's not. It really isn't. We've had some really good feedback from people who know the area. It's such a simple design, such a clear effect, and we just can't get it published anywhere. And I don't know why this is. Yeah, I don't know what is going on with this paper.
No, I mean, all jokes aside, we've both said at different parts over this last 5 years that it is the best paper we've ever written. And I can hand on heart say that it is the best thing that I've ever written. And I that's not a reflection on my other work either. We're genuinely not being bitter about it, but it's just astonishing. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a link to the preprint in the crib notes, and we will invite anybody, even if you've just started writing your own journal, it's on the back of a textbook. We will go on the peer review with you because we need to get this off our desks. I don't know where else we take it, but the frustration's there, isn't it? And the problem is with that paper is yes, it has suffered some of these kind of larger gripes that we've talked about in terms of the peer review process, but we've had lots of kind of editorial stoppages there as well, and we could hypothesize about it, being Brexit related or this interplay, but there's been nothing to suggest that it is about that.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm a little bit more cynical about that than you, I think, Dean, because I think having dabbled in political psychology, there are biases around. And I think the fact that so one of our other findings in this paper was that people who voted Remain and Democrat were more polarizing than people who voted Brexit and Trump. And it might be that that's just because they lost the vote. I don't know. But I think there are some biases inherent in the field, and that's not a conversation for today. If there are for-profit editors listening to this, we've had just over 1,200 views on SciArchive, this paper, 850 downloads as well, so it's not doing too badly on that. If you want clicks, this is also a paper that can get you clicks as well.
Very much so. So that brings us to the end of topic 3, and also the end of the podcast. I'm going to thank Craig, as always, to summarize what turned out to be what we wanted from the offset to be a very nice conversation about the peer review process. But I understand that it's could for new individuals in terms of coming into academia, PhD students, master students, it can sound a little bit harrowing, but we will stick out a YouTube video at some times just to talk about some of the more positive experiences that we've had as well. But I kind of guess that's what breeds honesty, doing this live. So thank you very much, all of our existing listeners, and welcome in all of the new listeners as well. We've been Dean and Craig, as always, from iProgress. Make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're not already, and also our podcast on Spotify if you're listening over there, and we will catch you in the next episode.